different ways. There are different parents or families that one might emulate. So
No, totally fair,
right.
totally fair.
But it's interesting that you point out that the NAACP didn't have a sort of criminal, or the Legal Defense Fund didn't have this criminal justice thing, because, you know, I'm a historian of the Black freedom struggle whose first book is World War I era,
Yeah.
right? And there are all of these moments, interesting moments in that period when branches are writing the national office and saying, we've got this boy, this soldier, because I'm writing about World War I, who has this stuff happening to him, and you need to step in and you need to do something. And only rarely do they at that moment, but it opens up. You know, in the 30s, they get involved in kind of controversial criminal things, thinking of Scottsboro, for example, where the communists went into the defense and the NAACP was like, not just you, us, right? And they sort of fought over who would defend them. But there's a moment when that civil rights, what we call now civil rights work, was quite expansive, right? And the willingness to be that expansive or that daring in some ways is truncated by the coming of the Cold War and the kind of domestic sort of conservatism that pared away some of the other kinds of work that they're doing. So it's interesting to think about us making our way, the sort of people who are active and thinking about good things for people, making our way towards back to a more expansive vision of what one should be focusing their efforts on.
Yeah. No, that seems right to me.
I have all kinds of questions and I'm trying to think about how to structure them. I'm taken with the book overall, right? I paused the first time I picked it up, right? So the book is Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America, which made me think, oh, this is a book that's written to me, right? That there's a way in which you're speaking to multiple audiences at one time, I imagine. But am I correct that part of this is saying, hey, Black people, we need to pause and think about the ways in which we participate in a system, and our needs and our desires and our efforts have brought about consequences that we don't want and didn't mean. But we were in there too, and have to have that sort of fully envisioned conversation, way of thinking about it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I guess from a historical standpoint, I just can't. I don't like going to movies. I don't like watching television shows. Like I don't like anything that's about America and doesn't have Black characters in it. Just like pisses me off. And so I knew I wanted to write a book that was grounded in all of the actors in the book. 95% of the people in the book are African American. Activists, legislators, columnists, journalists. Right? That's who's depicted in the book. It's a Black world. And I know that rich history exists. I know those, growing up, we talked about, we both grew up in Atlanta and then living in DC. I grew up in communities where there were all sorts of debates and arguments and dialogues happening within the Black community. And I felt like none of that was really being represented on the page when people talked about the politics of race and crime. And so I felt like I wanted to portray that. And then, so part of it was just telling the stories, like whatever the answer was, like having those voices be represented. But yeah, then when you move to the question of, okay, so then what's the argument, right? Yes, I initially wrote the book thinking that it would mostly appeal to Black readers, that I didn't, there's not a long tradition of people outside the Black community reading books that are full of Black characters, right? And so I wasn't super optimistic about it being widely read. And so I thought, okay, I'm writing to black people about what we've been doing over the last 50 years, trying to show it in nuance, trying to show it with complexity, trying to show the complaints that the constraints that people were under, so not ignoring the larger structures of racism and white supremacy that constrain folks, but fundamentally giving people some agency and saying, look, we made some choices, and some of the things that we did, even if they were understandable reasons, have had these destructive consequences. Let's do something different now. Let's do something different going forward. So yeah, that was fundamentally what I was trying to do in the book. And then the fact that anybody else read it, I couldn't believe it. I was so happy.
Okay. And is that also why it's a book and not, say, a law review article, right? That you wanted to be speaking to a black public that wouldn't necessarily be like, I've never read the Michigan Law Review.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh, for sure. I mean, well, wanting to speak to a public in general, because nobody, like my mom, would read like the Michigan Law Review article that I wrote, and not too many others. People would.
My mom would. So
really? All right. Yeah. See, my mom is cool. But yeah, I wanted, right. So that is definitely why it's not a law review article, and structurally, it's also why it is history, but it's got a lot of stories that are woven through the book, and the stories that are stories of my clients, stories of me, stories of other public defenders, those are there for two reasons. One, they're there to show the stakes, because the book, so much of it is about the 70s, 80s, 90s, like it's about when this punitive system was built. But if you don't, for a general reader, you also need to know, like, so why did it matter that they voted for mandatory minimums in 1982? Why is that? So you need a story today to show somebody confronted with those mandatory minimums to show how unfair it is. So the stories serve that purpose, and they also just serve to kind of humanize and make it and draw in the reader. I mean, that's fundamentally, I'm trying to get people to pay attention to this stuff, and individual stories help with that.
And I think that there's something about the way that you see sort of life and consequences cascading and burying people beneath them that you get through those human stories that you wouldn't otherwise, right? So, I mean,
that's right.
There's, in some ways, enough talk about, say, mandatory minimums or even kind of over-policing in certain neighborhoods, that in some abstract way, I think we get it.
Yeah.
But when you talk about the woman who should have said, don't search my car, who didn't, and they found a little bit of pot, and she didn't end up going to jail for it, but she did end up getting fired. Like, the ways that you think about how these things are interconnected, that you can see through one person's story, that wouldn't, I mean, there are other ways to make things clear, but that sort of having someone carry the consequence to the reader really works well.
Yeah, so I think that's right. And so, like, Sandra Dozier's story, one of the reasons why I felt like it was important to have stories like that was that it shows, some of a big part of my argument is around unintended consequences. And so, like, the key character in that chapter is Eric Holder. And Eric Holder pushes this regime of pretext policing on Washington, D.C. He basically works with the police department and says, we're just going to stop cars and we're going to pull them over and we're going to ask people if we can search their car. And he does it because gun violence is really high. And they don't do it all over the city. They do it in black neighborhoods, poor black neighborhoods in particular. Now they're going for guns, right? And so part of what I'm trying to do in the story is show, I think his motivations, I do think he cared about the black community, right? Like, and so, but now they search, so now they pull over Sandra Dozier. They ask her for consent to search. She grants it because everybody does. The studies show 95 to 98% of people say they're going to consent. Well, often because people think the police are going to search anyway. So they think, well, if they consent, then maybe like the search won't be as thorough because the police have, it's like, I have nothing to hide. And then they find marijuana. And the criminal justice system thinks it's being lenient because they don't prosecute her for the marijuana. But she is arrested, and that arrest goes on her record, and then she loses her job at FedEx, and it could be any employer, I'm not trying to single them out. She loses her job because she's on probationary status, and the rules are to get off of probationary status and to become a full-time hire, you have to have a record check, and you can't have any arrests during that time period. So now, this woman has worked so hard. She stood in hours and hours of lines at job fairs to get that job. She's got a baby she's trying to take care of, and now she's lost it, and it was all started with this pretext policing. And so, yeah, some of it, because I do, you're right, I feel like even when people say that they get it, they don't really necessarily get it. They don't see all the ways in which, as you said, so not, the ways in which it kind of crushes people down, and so yeah, so you're right, the stories serve that purpose.
The other one that sticks out to me is the one that you end with, right? This really powerful story about a young man who's robbed someone, armed robbery. Right?
Robbed somebody with a knife. I mean, he's got a knife in his pocket.
Right? And you can imagine how horrible, frightening, traumatizing perhaps that was for the person that he robbed. And you defend him and realize, I mean, it's almost like, I don't know, something out of The Wire, right? The sort of ways in which the social creates the sort of individual and then these interpersonal, but this kid's life has been a mess. Yeah. And there are all kinds of things that push him in, so many external factors that push him in the direction of this bad decision that you stop being able to think of it as perhaps an individual bad decision. But he does, and he apologizes, and you carry that apology to the victim, yep, who accepts it and endorses your request to the judge that he choose a more humane, we might say, or productive option. Yep. Right? Yep. And the kinds of contending with the world and what it is, the kinds of compassion and the kinds of pause and self-awareness that every player in that story has to marshal and mobilize to end up at the end, right, is remarkable to me.
Yeah. And it's so funny because you're focusing on these stories, and one of the reasons why, and you mentioned The Wire, and so The Wire is an amazing set of stories. And one of the arguments that I make wrapped around the story of Dante, who's the person who I'm talking about. And so one reason I wanted to write about him was, I feel like in a lot of literature about unfairness in the criminal system, two things happen. Either people talk about clients who are innocent, right, or people talk about clients who had drugs and that was it. And I felt like I wanted to talk about somebody who, armed robbery is a serious crime. It's actually more people are in prison for armed robbery than any other offense in the list of offenses we consider violent offenses in the system. So it's very representative. And he did it. Right. And it was no question. And I felt like I didn't want to run away from that. Right. But one of the arguments that I'm making in that chapter is that if we're going to have real reform of this system, it's not going to be, you can't do this thing that so many people do, including our former president, who I loved him at the time, and I sure love him more every day now. But one of the things that he did, President Obama did, was he always would talk about nonviolent drug offenders. He's going to do reform for non-violent drug offenders. But if you commit a violent crime, I don't have any sympathy for you. And we hear that. I mean, Kamala Harris is saying the same thing today on the campaign trail.
We'll get to some questions about her.
Okay. But Dante committed a violent crime, and here's the crazy thing about President Obama. He says this thing about violent crime, and then when he was asked what his favorite television show was, he said The Wire. There's no non-violent offenders in The Wire, not one. Not one. Bubbles, the heroin addict, is the closest, and even he commits a more violent, comes close at one point. So, but here's the thing, we don't think of them that way because we understand the whole social context of their lives, as you just said, and so we understand them. If you were to press, it was like, oh yeah, he did. That's true, actually. Oh yeah, he did shoot that guy. But it's not. We don't label them violent offenders. They're people who have done many things in their lives, and yes, and who committed, a violent offense, and that's, I think. So the stories are the way you help people move past the label, and that's one of the things I'm trying to do with Dante's story.
And I think the other way, I talk about The Wire too much, so you can say, but like one of the other ways in
Can't talk about The Wire too much. Well, not possible.
The way that the book and The Wire remind me of one another is that actually, if you were to say, what is The Wire about? I would say The Wire is about state economy and society and late-stage capitalism.
Okay.
Also about some really awesome people, and I still refer to Michael B. Jordan as Wallace no matter where he shows up,
no
and
doubt.
I cry no matter how he dies in whatever
doubt.
thing he shows up in, right? So it's that sort of fusing of those two things, but always returning us to some sense of structure and the overarching things that shape possibility, even with contingency and agency inside, right? And I think that your book is doing something similar, that it's saying this is a book that is on some level about structural racism, but naming what we mean in that and actually pulling back and interpolating between individual choices and an awareness that those choices take place within certain systems. And so for me, I've been thinking a lot lately in my own writing about the ways in which white supremacy and state violence remake themselves and each other in the wake of the civil rights gains of the mid-1960s. And I've got a sort of young man's encounter with the police, and I have a rabidly racist cop who then becomes a lawyer defending cops involved in officer-involved shootings, right? I have villains. My book has villains, right? It has tragedies and very few heroes, but it has villains. But one of the things that your book reminds me is to actually be more subtle and supple in my thinking and analysis and say, like, sometimes there aren't bad guys, right? There are bad choices, there's short-sightedness, there are people you probably don't even like, but that doesn't mean that they are nefariously trying to, that they can be participating in the stitching back together of the relationship between white supremacy and the state while trying to do something good for a large number of people.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing to like see your way out of on some level.
I think that's right. I think it was easier for me because I was writing about African American characters, and so, because like if I was writing about Jeff Sessions, it would be, I don't know how, like I would just be like, yeah, bad guy. Like I don't know how to be all like, all supple and nuanced. It's just like, but I felt like because so many of the people, because I was writing about somebody like Eric Holder or many other people that whose names won't be as well known to the audience, but African American elected officials whose many of them were making choices that I think in retrospect produced damaging consequences. And I also want to even say at times, I'm always on this tension of should they have known, because there were people, there was opposition. It's not like, and I do try to present that there was a counter narrative to all of these and all these moments. But having said that, even though there was opposition, I am sympathetic in many cases to the motivations, but I think that comes from the fact that so many of the people that I'm writing about, I think, do fundamentally care. Like I think Eric Holder wakes up in the morning thinking about one of the things, it's not the only thing, but one of the things he thinks about is like what's good for the Black community. Right. I really do believe that. And so when you're writing about people like that, it's like it's easier to be in this place. Right. But I do get, people will come up to me, especially, typically there's a generational divide on this. Some younger people are like, you're too nice, you're too kind. To, you know what I mean? Like, come on, they had to have known. Like, why are you, yeah, you criticize the choice, but but you cut them too much slack, you know? So, and I wrestled with that throughout the writing.
And did you have any pushback from people who said, why focus on this topic of black people's choices, which sort of makes it look like we're responsible for this thing that you know we aren't?
Look, this is the number one thing I worried about when I was writing the book. Number one thing. And I think to this day, I know there's people who, look, we're all busy. I know there's people who look at the title or even hear somebody say the one sentence of what it's about, and they're like, nah, I'm good. I'll pass. Because we're all just busy and there's only so much we can read, and there are people and so for me, my great fear was twofold. One, that people would co-opt it and say, well, if black people supported these policies, then they must have been good policies.
Right.
Or if black people supported these policies, they must not have been racist.
Right.
And I didn't want either of those. I fought hard for either of those interpretations of the book to be how a reader would understand it. But it really, I mean, I gave a workshop. For those of you that aren't in academia, we present. One of the things we do that's great fun about our job is that we get to go present chapters of material to other professors at other campuses. And I gave a workshop on a Monday at Columbia Law School and on Tuesday at Fordham Law School. And the one at Fordham was to students, and this is important. It wasn't to faculty members. And it was the same material. It was a chapter of the book. And Columbia went fine, and then I was at Fordham, and it was the worst 2 hours of my professional life. The first student said, I was picking up started reading this, and I thought, who is this black neocon? I had to look you up to try to figure out, like, what is this guy? Why is he saying this? This argument is going to be co-opted. And it was basically 2 hours of people saying, like, you shouldn't write this, da-da-da-da. And I was so mad when it was over. And I was mad at them, and I was defensive, and I'm driving back to New Haven. And I'm thinking, well, why did the workshop on Monday go well? And I realized that what I had presented because of page limits was just the history, but it had none of these stories. Like, I don't appear as a character, and there are none of the client stories. And I realized that the answer was actually embedded in this first student's comment, which was, who is this guy? Right. The Columbia faculty, they know me, they know my work, they've read previous things, they know I'm a critic of the criminal justice system, they know that I think racism is everywhere. Like, they're not gonna misread me in that way. But these students didn't know me, but this was crucial, because if you're gonna write a book for a general audience, you're not writing to people who know you, you're writing to people who don't. And so it made me go back and bring in a lot more stories, in part to make sure the reader knew, to always remind the reader that, yes, I'm telling this history, and yes, I think it's important, because I think for the reasons you said in your first question about what black people do is important, but these were not good policies, and this was a group of people that was acting under incredible constraint. And the constraint is structural racism and white supremacy. And so don't read any of this material as in any way suggesting that racism is not a core part of the explanation for how we got here. So if I hadn't had that workshop, honestly, I might have might have been the reception to the book in the public, as opposed to among 25 people at Fordham. So I am forever grateful to those 25 third-year law students at Fordham. They saved me.
The fusty historian in me is like, that young man did bad research. Like,
what's that?
The young man who was like, I went and looked you up. Who was this guy? It's like, did you read what he wrote? Did you think about the fact that that this is a book that exists alongside other books? I mean, it's fussy. Round. If you're gonna do research, do research. Don't pretend like you did research. So I'm going to change tack a little bit, because I recently heard Jed Sugarman, speaking of Fordham, who was a law professor at Jed Sugarman University, at Fordham University, talking about this idea of the sort of prosecutor politician.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh,
So
okay.
that,
I need to check that out.
yeah, it's really interesting, and I think his data, he's actually posted his data online, so
Okay.
it's publicly accessible.
Okay.
But one of the points that he makes is that if you think about who's being really sort of holding the line on this sort of hard on crime, harsh sentencing, that prosecutors are often far ahead of kind of the sort of general population around them. And it's
Far
not-
ahead
in terms of they're more intent. They're more
punitive?
More punitive
Got it.
than necessarily the sort of their communities would want them to be.
Yes.
And it's not about being elected as a prosecutor. It's that the sort of position of prosecutor has become, sort of U.S. attorneys and whatnot, have become stepping stones to high-level political
Okay.
office.
Yep.
And so the rhetoric of being tough on crime versus being soft on crime is something that they use, right? And so I'm wondering, like, how we think about something like a politician prosecutor, and how we think about. This, of course, led me to Kamala Harris to some extent, from whom you can see that narrative. It's worked better for her than Chris Christie, say, for his own individual choices, we might argue. But that there are a lot of
He made his bed.
Yeah, he made his bed, and he can run around fussing about it now. But there are a lot of Californians who are resistant to Harris, right, because of what they see as her the sort of her sort of punitive or sort of overzealous sort of stuff in California. But I look at that and I think about our sort of broader conversation, and I wonder, how does one draw, like, how much do you hold someone accountable for working within a system the way that it is set up to work, and for not being visionary enough to see beyond, or to be ambitious enough to not want to be visionary enough, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think it's super hard. I'm trying to write something about this right now, actually, and it's hard. In her case in particular, it's hard in part because there's so much that is unbelievable. Like, just take policy out of it. There's just so much about who she is as a person that is so inspirational. There was that New York Times 2 weeks ago, I think, had a cover story, and she was in South Carolina, and she was surrounded by her sorority sisters. And I remember looking in that picture, and I remember it brought me back to like early Obama, and thinking like the power of, especially given where we are right now as a country, the power of black women who are underrepresented in this book, in significant part because this book is mostly about elected officials in this time period, and because of sexism within the black community, within black politics, black women in particular are always told, step back, wait your turn, etc. And so the power of seeing like these 6 or 7 black women that were there gathered together around Harris, and looking in their facial, like how they were looking at her, and the unbelievable kind of pride that they had in her, there's something special about that, and so that for me, matters, and at the same time, the record is, I think, for me, is very challenging. It's not just about not being visionary, but some of the stuff, at least for me, that it's hard for me to sort of deal with are when she's Attorney General and there's prosecutors both in San Francisco when she's the DA and then in the state when she's the Attorney General, who have been, there's a lab technician who is basically like making up evidence, and there are all these faulty convictions, and she goes and so there's hundreds of people basically with convictions, some of them in prison, some of them just out with all the damage that having a conviction means to your life, and she's defending those convictions to the last degree, including even calling the judge that is challenging those convictions biased because the judge is married to a defense attorney. And now that all that, eventually was thrown out, but to fight tooth and nail to keep those convictions in place, or then later as Attorney General, similar thing happens down in Orange County. And, for me, that makes me wonder about how somebody's going to respond to challenges to their power and their authority. And so that goes beyond your position on a particular criminal justice issue or not. But that's like, okay, wrongdoing has happened on your watch. You now have a choice. You can call people to account, right? Fire the prosecutors, admit error, overturn the conviction, set free those people, or you can fight, defend, give no ground. And I think that prosecutors, and this is where Jed Sugarman comes in, so many of them have come up in a culture where that's what you do. You just keep fighting. And it doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to be that way as a prosecutor, but so many are. See, this is it. When you go into court and you say for the people, right, and then, see, this is the thing about a defense attorney. We don't say for the people. So we're not under any illusions. Like, we know we're fallible. Right. But when you come in and you say for the people, and then it turns out that we're not for the people, how do you admit that to yourself? And a lot of prosecutors can't. So it's not really about her, it's about the position. So I don't want to, I don't think anybody should be, I'm not going to disqualify anybody based on the position that they've held. But a lot of people in the 90s were becoming civil rights lawyers and public defenders. How about some of them for president? Right. Michelle Alexander became a civil rights lawyer. Right. Bryan Stevenson became a death penalty lawyer. Right. How about them? Right. I'm in.
I'll take Stacey Abrams. I don't even know what she was doing, right? But she's...
Well, right, exactly. Oh, no, I love me some Stacey Abrams.
We could just sit here. Y'all just sit while we stare off into space.
Exactly. The Wire and Stacey Abrams.
These are, if you take nothing else away from this evening. Your book actually reminds me a little bit of Bryan Stevenson's. There is something in your book that reminds me of something in Bryan Stevenson's book, I should say, which is a kind of underlying compassion to it, right? That I have to say is really heartening to see and read, right? It just feels, I think it opens you up to ideas in a certain way, but it also just reminds us that it's possible to move through parts of the world or the world with that with compassion as a goal, right? Which doesn't mean flatly accepting anything and everything, but
that scene in his book, to me, there's so much to love about that book. It might be the best. It's one of the 5 best books I've ever read. There's a scene where he talks about the officer in the prison in Alabama when he's going to visit his client, and there's a truck parked in the prison, and it's got Confederate flags and Obama's your president, not mine, and all this stuff. And Stevenson's grossed out by this naturally. And that officer, there's a whole weaving and sort of river to it. But in the end, that officer ends up becoming, his ally, at least for a moment. And there's this moment of grace where this officer allows him to bring in a milkshake to his client. And part of it is that the officer himself had been abused as a child. And he just flips everything in this really, I think, beautiful. So when you said, I think it's compassion, that's what I think about when I think about Bryan Stevenson always. And that story, for me, almost more than any other, captures it.
Yeah. But I think that's what I also respond to in the Dante story, right? Is that Mr. Thompson, is that the man?
Thomas.
Mr. Thomas, who's basically I imagine what I would want for my son if he were in his shoes. Courageous thing.
Yeah.
Whew.
Yeah.
So I'm going to turn it over to the floor in a second, but I wanted to spend a quick second, since we're in North Carolina, and this is something that we think about in the state a lot, talk a little bit about the choice to open a charter school or to found a charter school, right? And I know that in DC it is also not simple, right? And I think there's some part of me, my kids are in the Durham public schools, and we've watched in this state, very often charter schools are a way to pull resources out of public schools to redirect, right? So in my most doctrinaire moments, I'm like, look at all of these examples of the moment when we stopped believing in an idea of the public, right at the moment when African Americans get full access to the public, right? And I'm gonna go rant and name all these things, but I wonder, one, I assume, because usually when I rant, I'm being oversimplistic, right? But that,
But there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, but go ahead.
but that also, people keep founding them because there's a need, and there are different kinds of charter schools and all this.
That's we'll get to it, but go
So,
ahead.
what did that decision look like, and what has it meant for the students who have passed through there and for the founders who look at it?
Yeah. So I do think there are different kinds, and there's different, and I've been very, so we started our school in 1997. So we were the second or third charter school to open in Washington, D.C. So there was no such thing as a charter school movement at the time. There weren't charter school networks. There weren't big kind of right-wing or conservative philanthropists, investing in charter schools. And we were a community-based organization. We were a community-based nonprofit that was working with kids in the juvenile system. So we started an after-school tutoring and job training program for kids that had been arrested. We bought a little pizza shop, and we told kids from the juvenile courts, come to our program, and our program meant you go do tutoring for 2 hours a day. That was like the requirement. And then when you finish your tutoring, you got to work. Got to work in the pizza shop, got paid DC minimum wage, a couple dollars above the federal minimum wage, not a ton of money, but when you're 16 and you have no money, good money, and you got to work and you got to, do work with your hands and produce a product. And we would do lessons around, math lessons around like the amount of pizza sauce that we needed to order based on how many deliveries next week, and next week Howard University's got a holiday on Friday, and do the math. We wrote press releases for the business. We would go door to door, trying to drum up business. And we were this little nonprofit, but our kids were stuck in most of them had been kicked out of the traditional public schools. They had been shunted into alternative schools, which in theory, give kids who need the most the best. In reality, give kids who need the most the least. Give them the worst teachers, the least robust curriculum, the largest classes, the most chaotic hallways. And these are the kids that are already way behind in school. How's that going to work? So those are our kids. So they're either not in school. Like if you ever see kids at noon or 1 o'clock who are like 16, who are like out on the corner, and you're like, what are they doing there? Those are our kids. And then our kids were the ones that were in these terrible schools. And so when this law passed, it allowed us to turn our little after-school program into a full-time. The first thing we did was we went to the school system. And because we wanted to start a school before there was a charter school law. We said the school system, we don't want any money. All we want is permission from you we want you to give credit for the work kids are doing with us so that they can get a diploma. And the schools, you imagine, DC public schools, two lawyers with like 10 kids in a pizza shop. They're like, there is like no category for that. So the charter school law passed, and it felt to us like a godsend, because we could now take this little program and turn it into a full-time school. So we've done that. We just had our 20th anniversary. It was named after Maya Angelou because, of course, the kids, we did a school naming competition, and one of the students wrote an essay about how all the kids in the school have faced incredible adversity and overcome it, and she drew on Maya Angelou. And we were then invited about 10 years later by the city to open up a school inside the juvenile prison in DC. So we now run two, one in the community and one in the prison. We've never held ourselves out. We don't beat up on the public system. We don't say we're better than the public system. We call ourselves an ally of the public system. We believe in public schools. My kids go to public school. David's kids go to my co-founder go to public schools. We intentionally position ourselves as not, we think that we're doing something that the public schools are either, we're incapable or unwilling or kind of some combination. We're meeting a niche. We are a niche operation with a particular mission and a particular set of students. And we think we want the day to come when a school like ours no longer needs to exist because the public system will develop within its own world a school like this, and then we can take all of our kids and we can take them right over there and we can say, job done. Let's go on, let's move on. So we are not, I think, we're like not really a way to talk about the broader politics of like charter schools in America. At least I don't think so.
DC public schools might need several schools like yours rather than just one school.
A couple.
Yeah. All right. Hey y'all, what you thinking? See, I'm gonna have to. Where's I can?
There's
Okay,
a gentleman
yeah.
right
let
there.
him.
I see you talking about actors create unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And also about Senator Harris. So last semester, DA Krasner came through the law school. And DA Krasner, Krasner.
Oh, got it.
Yeah, had a bit of a provocative statement saying, if you're going to go into criminal justice, like you're doing you disservice by becoming a PD if you have the opportunity to work for one of the maybe 10 or so progressive prosecutors in the country. So I wonder what you thought about that movement.
I like Larry Krasner a lot. He's a friend of mine. He's come to my class. I totally disagree with that statement, and he said something similar when he came to my class, and I told the man that I totally disagree with him. So let me say this. I think that the movement of people that are fed up and frustrated and are outsiders and who are dissatisfied with the existing logic in our criminal justice system, in our criminal legal system, the movement for some of those people to think, hey, like Larry, hey, I can run for head prosecutor and I can actually remake this office. To me, that is one of the most exciting movements in the country. And I donate personally, I give money to people who are running for office. I tweet about them. I lift them up in every single way that I can. I encourage my students to go work there, including in Larry Krasner's office and in Rachel Rollins's office in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, in Wesley Bell's office in St. Louis, and a number of others as well. I do think we have to be careful about, because it's getting to the point now where progressive prosecutor is this mantra, and we need to have some actual meaningful metrics to figure out, is somebody actually remaking the system, or is somebody, making kind of mild changes, and they've just decided that this is the mantra that that this is like the hot label now, so they're sort of doing what they've always done. Maybe they don't prosecute some marijuana possession cases, but otherwise they do what they've done and they say, I'm a progressive prosecutor. So we need to be careful in evaluating each of these individuals, both in terms of their vision and also their ability to transform their offices, because you can want to become, you can even have the right vision, but if you can't make changes in personnel, either to bring people along, right? When you take over those offices, it's not like you have a whole, like Krasner's like 600 lawyers in Philly, and I don't know how many Rollins has in Boston, but there's a bunch. And they were all hired under an old regime. So now you got to figure out how many folks can be retrained to do it your way, how many are going to have to go, how many can you turn over, how many can you turn over, meaning fire. And so that's an issue. But where I disagree with what he said is this idea of like you be doing a disservice. I mean, I just think that's crazy talk. Different people are going to want to contribute to the movement to end mass incarceration in different ways. Some people are going to be inspired to go become a prosecutor and figure out ways where they can divert more cases out of the system, ask for fewer years than they otherwise would ask for. And that's great. But other people are going to fight in a different way. Other people aren't comfortable asking for somebody to go to prison. Don't feel like they ever know enough about another person. Think about what a prosecutor has to do, even in a progressive office. They have to go to court, and in some cases, they have to ask for somebody to be locked up. Right now in Philadelphia, they're holding people, they're imposing money bonds on people, they're asking for prison sentences, fewer, but they're still asking for them. Some people don't want to do that, and some people don't want to do that in a world where they feel like they don't actually know the person, they don't really know the person who's charged with the crime. And they don't, because as a prosecutor, you can't. You know a charge, you might have some background information. Some people feel like, I want to be the person that stands next to the vulnerable individual. I want to be the person that stands next to the one that everybody in the courtroom is looking evil at. I want to be the person to stand next to that person who's never gotten a fair shot in life and say, today in this courtroom, somebody is going to hear your story. Somebody is going to lift up your voice. Somebody is going to interrupt the judge when the judge starts to interrupt. Move on, no, I'm not done, Your Honor. I'm not done. Counsel, are you done? No, Your Honor, I'm not. You haven't heard everything that you need to know about Dante. And you keep going. Somebody has to be that fighter. And people are drawn to that. So to suggest that somehow somebody who wants to do that is in any way doing a disservice or making a lesser choice, I think is wrong-headed and offensive.
So I saw a hand up here and then we'll go.
Is that me?
Yes, that's you.
Okay, thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. Thank you to both of you. So my question is about, I went to this march in Raleigh last weekend.
First of all, good for you. I don't even know what it was, but I'm already happy. Somebody went to a march.
The Moral March, was that the one you went to?
What?
Did you go to HK&J,
Yeah.
the Moral March?
Yeah, and it was a march to the state capitol, and I had never been to the state capitol before, and I was struck by the number of Confederate statues there, which I guess maybe I should have known, but there were police officers all over the state capitol, and what I was really struck by was the guarding of the statues and the fencing around the statues and police officers behind those fences. And what really struck me was black police officers that were policing these Confederate statues. And so I just wanted, I've been thinking about this every day since last week, and so I just wanted to get your opinion, one on African Americans like working in this white supremacist system and guarding historical legacies of white supremacy, but also how they have to operate within these constraints that we talked about with prosecutors, right? And things that they have to give, but also how they can change the system as police officers. I don't know, there's a lot in there, but and also the last thing is the symbolism that for me, I took away as a black woman to see an African American police officer guarding a Confederate statue behind these structural barriers. I thought was really powerful. So
yeah, thank you for sharing that. Really, thank you so much, and thank you for going to the march. So we said nobody reads law review articles. The first law review article that I ever wrote, I wrote as a student. And you can find it on my webpage. James Forman, Yale Law School, click publications, you'll see it's the first, probably, the oldest one. It's called Driving Dixie Down, Removing Confederate Flags from Southern State Capitals. And it was written in 1992. I was a third-year law student. And the piece was motivated by, and I tell a story in the law review article. So I was already, even when I was writing law review articles, I was like trying to figure out a way to like push the genre. The story, the article ends with a story. And the story was, I was a senior in high school in Atlanta Public Schools, almost all black high school. And every day, in my senior year, my homeroom was like right by the front of the school. The window was out to the front. And every day, I would watch our groundskeeper, African-American man, raise up the flags. And he raised up the US flag, and then he raised up the Georgia State flag, and then he raised up the Atlanta Public Schools flag. The Georgia State flag back then was basically 80% the Confederate flag with the Georgia seal on the left side. And every day I would watch that. And on some days, I'd be thinking about my homework or whatever. I didn't pay too much attention to it. But on some days I was really watching. And I couldn't, there were days where it would just catch me. I would just think about like the history of slavery and Jim Crow and lynching and dogs barking at demonstrators and the little girls being blown up in a church in Birmingham and all that flag stood for. And we were raising it up in a majority black school district, in a majority black school by a black groundskeeper. And it was so, there were days where I was like, almost couldn't breathe. Like there were days where I would be stuck in class and have to wait a few more minutes before I could even get to first period. And I don't hold, in that instance, there's no part of me that holds, obviously, our groundskeeper accountable in any way. There's no part of me that, in the story that you told, I don't hold those police officers accountable. They're doing their job, and I don't mean that in the like kind of messed up way in which we talk about it, but those seem to me to be, like if you were to have a continuum of like agency and constraint, to me, those individuals that you're talking about and the gentleman that I'm talking about, they're on the completely constrained end of the continuum. But that doesn't mean, so then though the question is, okay, so what about the rest of us? Like what do we do as a community to liberate them from their suffering and to liberate all of us from the suffering that we collectively feel when we live in a society where we have to continue on to honor people whose great contribution to American history was to defend the buying and selling and branding and breeding and lynching and family separation of another group of people simply based on their race. And it is to this moment. I mean, they don't have statues to the Nazis in Germany, and the notion that we would continue to celebrate that history. And I'm not talking about museums. Museums, things should be in museums. We have to have history, but there's a difference between public celebration and historical memory. And right now, what we do is public celebration, and we, I think, collectively have to continue to fight to change that.
So, ma'am, also there's a chapter on black policemen. Don't you talk about black policemen?
There is, sorry, chapter 3. See, you always say, you're the greatest moderator. I'm like talking about other stuff in Brian Stevenson's book, and you're like, yeah, but let's get back to your book. Yeah, chapter 3. Yeah, chapter 3. See, it's actually my favorite chapter.
In terms of like progressive people who get into prosecutor roles
Yeah.
or district attorney roles or sheriff roles, I don't know if you've heard a lot about what's been going on in Durham and Triangle Gateway. I just came back to town after 10 years. And it's a kind of remarkable electoral revolution that in the past year has put not only African American women into DA positions like sheriffs, 3 judges, but community-based people. In the context of the kind of national end money bail campaign.
Yeah.
Because so many people, it's not like you want to get people out of this and they just never got to court. And they're sitting there because they're poor and they don't have money. Then they're accumulating debt and treatment. And so, in that context, recently, like the DA, one Tuesday afternoon, sat there and signed off on 500 traffic tickets. So that people aren't caught in the system and they miss. Or she's, one of the ideas that came up during her campaign was just not prosecute cases that come out of high schools. So just not the prison pipeline. The black sheriffs, or just the sheriffs here, said they're not going to use the jails to turn people over to ICE. So in the last 2 weeks, ICE just went out of the community and arrested 200-some people.
I saw a protest.
Yeah, there was a vigil this evening.
Yeah, and then 7 mayors, just in the paper yesterday or today, came out and said, we support our sheriffs against ICE. And, you know, so there's really an interesting, and we're kind of 2 months into this new regime, but it seems it's not like the public defenders versus folks.
Yeah.
And so Durham is a really interesting laboratory now, I think, for a different kind of system that has a kind of transformative set of energies in it anyway, and it's not so clear where it would go. So I just wondered, like, and I mean, it's BLM, it's in the, you know, it's happening in a lot of places. It's happening here too. And
I should say I apologize. Often before I go somewhere, I do a little reading up on exactly these questions. And as you were talking, I was realizing that I had not done that before coming here.
I guess you have to come back.
Exactly. Because I remember this, like when, right after the election, I remember a couple of stories about what was going on in Durham, and didn't pay attention, and I didn't go back. So I think this is incredibly exciting. I mean, a huge part, one of the arguments in my book is that to understand how we got to have the world's largest prison system, it's easy to be distracted by and focused on what happens in Washington, D.C. and the president, the attorney general, but that fundamentally this is a state, county, and city and local issue. And so, right, most 88% of people who are incarcerated in this country are incarcerated in state prisons, and most of not federal, and most of those people are there because of a choice that was made by a city or county prosecutor. So that's why what you're doing here in Durham with that election, and as you said, it's not just Larry Krasner and the few others you mentioned, you have it right here. That's why actually that, in my opinion, still is the single most important and possibly transformative thing, because a decision like the decision you made about dismissing those tickets or those fees, or decision that's being made about bails, or how sheriffs treat people who are, because sheriffs typically, run the local jails where people are housed, and so how they run those, and how they treat people who are incarcerated in their facilities. These are issues that are of fundamental importance and often overlooked. And so all I can say to that is I think it's exhilarating. And
what do you think about prison abolition?
Sorry, say it again.
What do you think about prison abolition? Like Angela Davis?
Yeah, so what I love about prison abolition as a concept, but just so I have a sense, how many people in the room are familiar with the idea of prison abolition? Okay. Excuse me, about half the folks. So what prison abolition stands for, that appeals to me, is 2 things. 1, we have to imagine a world in which we don't have prisons, and in which we don't have a need for prisons. And we have to work to try to build and construct that world. And what I love about that is that it establishes a goal, it establishes an aspiration that constantly reminds us of how meager all the changes that we're putting in place, First Step Act or the election of this prosecutor, anything. These are all small steps, because we are very far from where we have to go. And so I love that. Where I struggle with, and this could just be semantic a little bit, I'm not sure, but I'm not optimistic that that day is ever going to come. That is to say, like, I just run down the list, Jason Van Dyke, police officer in Chicago who shot Laquan McDonald, 16, right, killed him, 16 shots. Then they all lied about it. The police conspired and said McDonald had a knife or gun and he didn't. They covered up the evidence, and it was only because of basically like some sleuthing that this tape came out, and then he got sentenced. He needs to be punished. And I think, at least for now, he needs to go to prison. I don't know what the other punishment is going to be that is going to be significant enough for that. Right now, we have multiple people in the administration who have totally run amok. Cohen, Manafort. I mean, I'm not abolitionist for them. So
We could send them to the Soviet Union, or to Russia.
no, but I'm saying, here's where I struggle is if I'm not abolitionist for them, then am I an abolitionist?
Right.
That's what I'm saying. Because everybody has, I happen to pick those cases, but
there's,
and then people will say back to me, well, they'll say, okay, but the places that we put people, they don't have to be like what we call prison today, and which I'm totally, places that are more humane, that are more caring, whose goal is to try to recreate a reasonable life on the outside. None of this crazy supermax. Talking about El Chapo is going to go to some place where it's 20 ADX in Colorado with 23 hours a day lockdown. I'm opposed to that for anybody. But then I start to feel like, at that point, I wonder, that sounds like reform. And so much of what I hear from abolitionists is, well, we're not reform. It's not reform. That's what it's held up in juxtaposition to.
Right.
And so the line starts to get blurry to me. So I don't know where that leaves me. I'm an aspiring abolitionist.
You aspire to be an abolitionist.
Yeah.
So we're at the end of our time. I want you to be able to say your question out loud so that we are thinking about it as our final thought.
Can you write a book that's aimed at white people, and white people buy, and they write, no, they are white, why they're white, how they came to be white, and the lies behind that principle that is enshrined in the Constitution from the beginning, for the reasons for the American Revolution are fundamentally racist, white supremacist, and the democracy of America is just a cloud of confusion, and the legal system has not changed anything about justice. There's no justice in this country. There will not be justice except in drama and on television. So when can you write a book?
Can I jump in and give it? So I keep giving people reading list suggestions. There's a book that won't do all of this for you, but it will do some of this for you, and it is The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter. So that's step one.
How many white people have read it?
I don't know. It's a trade book. You can go get it in a bookstore.
I know the story already. I don't need to read
Right.
it.
And then follow it up with Black Reconstruction by Du Bois, and that'll cover a lot of good ground. Did you want to? Okay, so I am sorry to end this conversation. I wish we could go all night. We can continue to have it informally. Well, first, Professor Forman will be signing books in the lobby, yes, but then around the corner. So we usually have the reception right here. Instead, it's off to the side, but it has Parker and Otis's chocolate-covered pretzels and a bar. It has other things, but I really focus in on the pretzels. So please stay with us, keep talking to each other, and let's carry it out of here and into new space. And thank you.